Thank you for being here. I know you're not going to be able to see the slides because I was on the third row and I couldn't see the slides. We'll try and improve on that in the future. So if you want to get a copy of my slides, just send me an email. Brian.Jenks, B-R-I-A-N, .Jenks at NDSU.edu. Okay, drought. We've had drought for a few years. Draw a little circle around Minot, and we've had more than our share of drought. And it certainly affected our weed control. It's affected the weeds that have emerged or not emerged. The last fall, we had, or 2 falls ago, we had no rain. We had no winter annuals emerge. How many people saw horseweed last year? A couple of you. How many people saw narrowleaf hawksbeard? A couple. So, yeah, so though the lack of rain in the fall certainly reduced the number of winter annuals that emerged. Now, we'll see how much emerges this next year or this next spring based on the rainfall that you got, but you may not have to deal with them. Obviously, there's a couple of weeds that really like drought, kochia and Russian thistle. And so we did see a lot of kochia and Russian thistle. And I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about kochia and a couple other subjects. The other issue that comes into play is how well your soil-applied herbicides work and whether or not you want to put out the money for those soil-applied herbicides if there's no rain in the forecast. Other issues we're going to deal with, herbicide price increases. Unfortunately, that's a reality. As I gathered the prices from companies to put in the back of the weed guide, I could see that a lot of the prices were much higher. Some of them were doubled. Not many of them, but there's a couple of them, they basically doubled the price. Herbicide shortages. We've been hearing rumors about shortage of Roundup, shortage of Liberty, Clethodim or Select. Hopefully those shortages aren't as bad as we've been hearing. I've actually talked to a couple of people that maybe think that the shortage won't be as bad as maybe we thought originally, but that's something we're going to have to deal with. And I will tailor my talk a little bit based on, okay, if for some reason you don't have Roundup to apply in your field, what can you use as an alternative? And then, okay. All right, what you can't see on this slide is just something I observed this year that I learn every year just like you do. So common mallow sometimes is a bad weed for us. And in one of my research plots, I had Spartan in the plot and common mallow. There's a big patch of common mallow. And on the left-hand side, maybe you can see dark versus light. But where the Spartan was, it actually controlled the mallow, which really surprised me, especially given how little rain we had this spring. And then, so I got excited about it, and I looked on the label, and it says, oh yeah, it's already on the label. Common mallow is controlled by Spartan. I was not aware of that, even though I've looked at that label many times. Now, some other herbicides that you can use for common mallow, just in general. Liberty, if you're using Liberty canola, very good on common mallow. Sharpen, one of the better products for mallow, whether you're applying it in a pre-plant situation or in the fall. Roundup plus Sharpen in the fall after a pea harvest or a wheat harvest works very well. Wide match, and then anything with starine in it, a starine express in wheat can work pretty well on common mallow. Okay, question about whether or not we should spend money on soil-applied herbicides in a drought. I've got a couple of pictures, one shown here. If you just look at the corn crop from left to right, you can see where we had a soil-applied herbicide down. We had very little rain, but even with the little rain we got, it made a difference in controlling the foxtail. In this case, it was green and yellow foxtail. This was corn, obviously, and even though we didn't get rain for at least 10 days after application, and then we didn't get that much even 10 days later, we could still see the effect. If you just look at trust me, the corn crop is here in the untreated, and the corn crop is way up here where the soil-applied herbicide worked well and gave us a huge benefit. So I'm still a proponent of getting the soil-applied herbicide out there, especially in our minor crops where we don't have a lot of post-emergence options. Okay, this weedy mess is kochia. This is from a soybean field, but you can barely see the soybeans in it. It's almost completely kochia, and this field is not far from here, where Roundup has been used way too much, and the rotation has led to kochia being the primary plant in the field. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about kochia because I think everybody has it here, and if Roundup is a little bit short, we'll talk about some other options. Okay, so let's assume that you're going to go to wheat. It used to be that maybe we would prior to our wheat crop would do a Roundup burn down, and then in crop we would maybe just use something less expensive like a starring type product, such as a wide match, supremacy, Colt plus Salvo, or any product that has starring in it. And that was our main control for kochia. Or in wheat, we might have used a Bronate type product. So the starring used to work really well. In fact, when I came here 25 years ago, there were weed scientists trying to see how low they could go with starring and still control it. And unfortunately, that was a mistake, because even Dow lowered their starring rate, and now we're starting to see some escapes from starring. So starring alone is not completely controlling the kochia anymore in many places in the state. And so we need to look at using something else besides starring alone. Also in our Roundup burn down, we're going to have to use something else because we've got a lot of Roundup resistant kochia throughout the state. It's not everywhere, but it's in a lot of places. Okay. So if kochia isn't Roundup resistant on your farm yet, then something like a Roundup burn down and a starring post might work. But I would encourage you to do something beyond that. To have something else in the tank with the Roundup, have something else in the tank besides starring. Okay, let's consider some other options. Many of you have been using Valor in the fall, and I think many of you have been successful with it, controlling winter annuals, as well as getting a little bit of kochia reduction in the spring. So that's something you could consider, since this is a wheat show. You could consider prior to wheat. Another thing you could consider, if you didn't get the Valor on last fall, there is a 14-day pre-plant interval for if you wanted to put Valor on in the spring, you can put it on 14 days prior to planting and get some residual control with Valor this spring. Then in your burn down, you could consider tank mixing with Roundup with something like Sharpen. Dicamba you can apply dicamba prior to wheat, but depending on which label you look at, there is a rotation interval that you have to wait. Some labels say 3 days per ounce of Banville. If you look at the Clarity label, it's 22 days. Gramoxone is another herbicide that, due to the closed system now with Gramoxone, it's probably a little bit safer to use, and it still works very well on kochia. Last year, that was one of our best treatments. Gramoxone on kochia worked extremely well. If we look at post options with no carryover, okay, that would be something like Bronate. Bronate is a bromoxynil MCPA, but the MCP really isn't adding much to the control of the kochia. It's mostly the bromoxynil doing the work. Others to consider would be Kochivore and Clean Sweep, and I'm just there are many other products that I could list up here, but I'm just giving these as an example. Kochivore has Starane, bromoxynil, 2,4-D. So you got at least 2 solid products there, 2 modes of action to control kochia with Kochivore and Clean Sweep D. Starane NXT is also Starane plus bromoxynil. I'm probably less excited about Starane NXT because they put a reduced amount of Starane in there. I would prefer the Kochivore Clean Sweep because they got the rates higher. So those are products that you could use that don't have carryover to the next year if you're going, say, to lentils. If you can deal with the carryover, Husky FX or a Talinor plus Starane would certainly be good options. Husky FX has Starane, bromoxynil, and pyrosulfatol. Has 3 modes of action. In our research trials, Husky FX has looked very solid on kochia. Even kochia that has some Starane resistance to it. We tested it in the Minot area, we tested it in the Rugby area, and it was very solid on kochia that has some Starane tolerance. Talinor is decent, but I think I'd rather add Starane to Talinor. What I think the biggest key, though, with these products is we have to apply them before the kochia exceeds 4 inches. I would rather see it go on 3 inches. I know you want to get every flush that comes, but we've seen Husky and Talinor and Bronate all fail once kochia gets 4 inches or greater. Any questions on this? Okay, what I wanted to attempt to show here was sharpen. Okay, when you're tank mixing Roundup and sharpen, those two can work very well on kochia. The problem comes in if your kochia is Roundup resistant, then the sharpen is doing all the work. And sharpen will do pretty well, but you've got to have, in order for sharpen to work well, you've got to have low weed density. The kochia has to be small, and you got to use a higher spray volume. So low weed density, small weeds. If the weeds are 2-3 inches, sharpen will work. If the weeds are 5-6 inches, sharpen's not going to cut it. The other thing I wanted to show here is sharpen does have a little bit of residual. Sharpen's in the same chemical family as Valor and Spartan, but it doesn't have the residual that Valor and Spartan do. It's got a hint of residual, just not that much. Here I wanted to show, many years ago, Roundup was working for us, and sharpen alone on larger weeds. Maybe you can see this color difference between the two. The color difference is where sharpen did not work on the larger weeds. So with Sharpen, you've got to hit that 2 to 3 inch weeds. If you let it get up to 6 inches, 5, 6 inches, it's not going to work. The other thing is, where you get those high kochia densities, where you get the kochia mat, that's where Sharpen's not going to work as well, primarily due to lack of coverage. Okay, so what I wanted to go through here was some different burn down options for kochia in different crops. So again, I apologize you can't see this. If you want it, just email me. But I wanted to focus on, if everything worked great, Roundup would work. But unfortunately, we're not seeing that. So first option might be AIM or Sharpen. If you're going to use AIM as your tank mix partner, AIM's got to be applied like on 1 inch weeds. And even then, it may not work that well. Sharpen is a better product than AIM. But again, maybe you can go 1 to 3 inch weeds or so with Sharpen. And then, what do we always, okay, so I'm going to re-emphasize this over and over, but AIM and Sharpen, Spartan, Valor, they're all group 14 herbicides. When we use those for foliar control, what do we tank mix with them? AMS and MSO. If you don't include the MSO, it's not going to work. So I say use Sharpen and AIM. Those are options, but you have to have the oil in there or they're not going to work. Glyphosate, Spartan Charge. We've seen glyphosate and Spartan Charge together. Or I should say, just Spartan Charge itself can work on kochia without the Roundup. But you got to have the oil with it. It's got to be small. The other thing that we've noticed over the years is with these group 14s, if you're spraying in 45, 50 degree temps, they're not going to work as well. If you can get lucky and get some warm temperatures, maybe at least in the 60s, these will work much better. I mentioned Gramoxone. Gramoxone is an excellent option. And you can tank mix Gramoxone and Sharpen. You can tank mix Gramoxone with Spartan Charge so that you're getting more burn down. If you don't want to rely solely on Spartan Charge, you can tank mix some Gramoxone with it as well. So that was herbicides that would be labeled in chickpeas. For dry peas, it would be exactly the same, except in peas, we can use metribuzin. Now, when I talk to Chet, he gets really nervous about metribuzin, and I understand why. In some soils, lighter soils with higher pH, low organic matter, metribuzin can ding up a crop. So you have to match your herbicide rate with your soil characteristics when you use metribuzin. And metribuzin is not for every soil. We say the same thing about Spartan. But in peas, we can use Gramoxone, and we could tank mix Gramoxone with metribuzin. We've actually seen a synergy with Gramoxone and metribuzin. On kochia, on horseweed, that's another option. Even a Spartan metribuzin. We've seen a synergy between Spartan and metribuzin. And I've got one slide in here where our data was our control was like 95, 97%. So that would work for peas. With lentils, obviously our options are fewer. We're down to glyphosate, Sharpen. We can use Gramoxone in lentil, Gramoxone Sharpen, or even in lentil a Gramoxone metribuzin. So there are different options that we have to control kochia if we're not using Roundup or if our kochia is resistant to Roundup. So I would hesitate to just rely on one mode of action. We've got several different options here. A gramoxone sharpen, glyphosate sharpen, gramoxone metribuzin. Those are options we can use in these crops. Any questions on this? Question is volume of water. Especially on these group 14s like a sharpen, aim, where you're trying to get foliar control, minimum 10 gallons. We've applied these at 5 and we see very inferior weed control. You've got to be 10 or more with these herbicides. Okay, safflower. Safflower, we can't use sharpen in safflower, but we can use Spartan Charge. You could go a glyphosate Spartan Charge, a gramoxone Spartan Charge. With flax, we could go glyphosate aim, glyphosate Spartan Charge, gramoxone aim. And I left out, we could also go gramoxone Spartan Charge. In soybeans, obviously you got the dicamba option, you got the Liberty option. Now Liberty and dicamba can be applied pre-emergence to soybean. And as of course post-emergence as well. So the soybean options, there are many, and I can't even list them all here. With tank mix, focusing on our group 14s like Sharpen, Aim, Spartan Charge, and then the gramoxone metribuzin, Spartan metribuzin, Valor metribuzin, Fierce MTZ. Those have all worked very well on kochia in a burn down, given that we've got small weeds, good water volume, warmer temperatures. I'm going to skip this. I've showed this to you for a few years, but this basically shows the effect of adding the AMS and MSO to control kochia foliarly. With these group 14s like Sharpen, Spartan, Valor, Authority MTZ, having the AMS and MSO will help you control the kochia that has emerged. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these slides just because you can't see them, but they're basically showing what I described to you, that something like a Fierce or a Valor in the fall will help reduce kochia in the spring. Here's another one that we did last year where we applied Valor in the fall. I was very curious to see how it was going to turn out because it was so dry. Where we had Valor in the fall, we reduced the kochia 60%, we reduced the Russian thistle 80% that emerged in the spring. This slide basically shows how we use these group 14 herbicides without Roundup to control emerged kochia. Again, applying these Valor Spartans with AMS and MSO, something like a gramoxone metribuzin works as well. But again, these are effective with warm temps, small weeds, low weed density, and a minimum 10 gallons. Here's some data showing gramoxone worked very well. This case, we got 97% control with gramoxone compared to the Sharpen didn't work very well here. I showed you other slides where Sharpen did work. This one, it did not work very well at all. And one of my notes here is because we had very high weed density. The gramoxone worked much better and seemed to work much better in the dry conditions. This is a slide showing Authority MTZ, which is Spartan metribuzin. That combination, we saw a synergy where it worked much better than Spartan alone. Okay, before I switch topics, any questions on kochia? All right, another issue we've had recently is green foxtail and wild oat resistance or lack of control. It's not always resistance. It could be something else that's causing the lack of control with green foxtail. It could be resistance. It could be antagonism with our whatever tank mix we have in the tank. For example, we know that Basagran antagonizes Select. Express antagonizes Assure 2. Bronate antagonizes just about everything. Could be reduced absorption because the herbicide isn't able to get into the plant because of dry conditions, reduced translocation, change in herbicide metabolism, maybe something at the site of action is changed so that the herbicide can't get to the site of action. So when we say that when we recognize that we didn't have control, it isn't always due to resistance. And what this slide shows is that basically there was a study done by Rick Boydston from the Pacific Northwest where he showed that the moisture or the stress level after application is what is key. If your plants are stressed after application, from the time you apply for several days after application, that's where you're going to see less control. That's where you see lower control due to drought stress. Where he did an irrigation event near the time of application, he still got good control. So the plants weren't drought stressed. But where he didn't do that irrigation, the plants were very drought stressed and the control was significantly reduced. So there's nothing you can do about that, but at least it tells you that what you might expect. If you got drought stress after application, you might say, man, I sure could use a rain. But there's really nothing that you can do about it. You need help from Mother Nature. Okay, in the resistance testing that we've been doing for the last 5 years, we've been seeing some trends. And so we found green foxtail and wild oat that are resistant to all group 1s. We've seen some that are resistant to group 2s, and sometimes a combination of both. So these next slides just summarize the trends that we see as we've been doing this testing. For example, with green foxtail, if you wanted to switch from Puma to Discover because you're trying to change herbicides, we've learned that that doesn't do any good at all because Puma and Discover are too much alike, and if it's resistant to one, it's resistant to the other. The one trend we have seen is with Axial, with green foxtail. About 25% of the time, Axial will still control the green foxtail when Puma doesn't. Now, that's not great odds, but if you're desperate, you maybe try Axial. Similar with wild oat. If it's resistant to Puma, if the wild oat's resistant to Puma, about 50% of the time, it's not resistant to wild oat. So Axial is still an option in some cases. It's a little bit different chemistry so that you could rotate. You probably always want to, in your wheat, rotate, group 1, group 2, and then, maybe when you do a group 1, maybe rotate Puma and Axial. With group 2s, the news isn't great. With Everest, Gold Sky, and Varro, those are our group 2s. We've seen that almost always, about 99% of the time, if the foxtail or wild oat is resistant to one, it's resistant to all three. So it's not going to do you much good to rotate between Everest, Gold Sky, and Varro. Now, the one difference we have seen, though, is with Raptor, especially with green foxtail. Raptor is also a group 2, but it's different chemistry, but it's still a group 2. It still inhibits that same enzyme that the others do. And 99% of the time, if a green foxtail is resistant to Everest, Gold Sky, and Varro, almost always Raptor still controls it, which tells you that you could use a Clearfield crop, such as a Clearfield sunflower, Clearfield wheat, and still control this foxtail. Unfortunately, with wild oat, it's not that good. Only about 25% of the time we find Raptor will still control wild oat that's resistant to the other group 2s. Okay, I get this question occasionally. I'm switching gears here. How do you, or maybe before I do, any questions on these grasses and the resistance? Yes? Okay, if I understood your question right, I think you're asking about trying to time your application relative to if you've got drought stress but there's a rain in the forecast. Okay, what one of the studies that Rick Boyston did said was if the foxtail was drought stressed one day after application, but the second day they got rain, they still got control. But if the rain came 2 to 4 days after application, they still lost control. So if you've got a rain that's within about 2 days after application, I'd go ahead and spray. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry, say it again? Other weeds? I'm going to venture a guess that they're going to be similar. I don't have any data other than that one to go on. But I'm just going to venture a guess that other weeds are going to react similarly. Any other questions? Okay. How do you control volunteer canola and peas? The answer is maybe a couple of herbicides you don't normally use, but some of you do use Pursuit still. Pursuit works well to control volunteer canola and peas. Metribuzin, soil-applied metribuzin also is very good on canola, on volunteer canola and peas. And then post-emergence, Basagran and Basagran plus Raptor or Varisto. If you're applying Basagran, it's got to be small, like 3-leaf volunteer canola. If it gets bigger than that, you probably better use a Raptor product like Varisto. How to control volunteer flax in peas? What we found is metribuzin will work, but it will be rate and soil dependent. Usually it's going to require a higher rate to control the volunteer flax. And then Pursuit has worked pretty well. Even at 1 ounce, Pursuit's given us about 80 to 85% control on the volunteer flax.